Hi everybody, it's Dr. Shawn Talbott, Chief Science Officer for MonaVie, and welcome to another edition of From the Lab. If I seem a little energetic in this edition, it's because I just finished drinking an EMV. We're going to talk about energy, and we're going to talk about fatigue for a few minutes on this edition of From the Lab. And I want to give you a perspective for what you have in your hands when you look at EMV. It's a completely different take on so-called energy drinks. I don't even like to call this an energy drink because what it really is an anti-fatigue drink. When I say that, sometimes I'm reluctant to say that because people think that I'm trying to play with the words and be a little wordsmith here, and that's not it at all. I like to talk about it as an anti-fatigue drink because of the way it works in your body. Now think about the traditional energy drink category, right? You know all the brand names. I'm not going to mention them here on the show, but you go down to your convenience store and the cooler is full of them. Some of them are in these little cans, some are in bigger cans, but you know what they are. They're caffeine bombs, big doses of caffeine and big doses of high fructose corn syrup. Is that going to give you energy? Of course it is. It's going to give you a jolt of energy, sort of a sledgehammer of energy, because that caffeine, synthetic caffeine, is absorbed into the body very quickly, delivered to the brain very quickly, and you get a benefit. Same thing with high fructose corn syrup. The sugar there is absorbed very quickly, gets into the bloodstream, gets delivered to the brain extremely quickly. You get a jolt, but the problem with the jolt of caffeine and the jolt of sugar is that you get the drop-off. You get the crash later on. 60 minutes later, 90 minutes later, it's a little bit different depending on the drink, depending on the person, depending on what else you have in your gastrointestinal tract at the time, but you're going to get it. You're going to get that drop-off. I have colleagues who study how high fructose corn syrup, how liquid sugar really purified like that, how it hits the brain. And it hits the brain and it hits specific receptors in a way that's very similar to other addictive substances such as nicotine or cocaine or heroin. And so, when people say that I'm addicted to my energy drink, there's actually some biological truth to that kind of a statement. Your brain does get accustomed to that because it's getting hit so hard in that very unique way. So how is EMV different? EMV is different in so many different ways. Let's talk about the sugar part of it to begin with. People will sometimes look at the side of EMV and they'll say, oh wow, that's a lot of sugar. I probably should avoid that. And I'll, as a nutritionist, I'll say, well, yes, it is a good dose of sugar. But think about what this sugar is, right? These carbohydrates are delivered to the body and utilized in the body in a completely different way. So the key sugar that we have in EMV is a sugar called palatinose. That's the brand name of this very specific sugar called isomaltulose. It's very different than fructose, very different than sucrose, very different than high fructose corn syrup. And the difference is in how it's absorbed. The difference is it still tastes sweet, it still tastes delicious, but when it gets to your gastrointestinal tract, it's broken down, it's digested at a much slower rate, so it's absorbed into the bloodstream at a much slower rate, and it's delivered to the brain at a much slower rate. Now the difference between all of that might seem subtle, but it makes all the difference in the world. The difference is that it's not going to give you a jolt. So if that's what you're looking for, I'm sorry. That's not what EMV was designed to do. That isn't what the main outcome is. The main outcome of having palatinose delivered slowly into your system, more drip instead of a fire hose, it's really that your brain wakes up in a very unique way. One of the receptors in your brain that perceives fatigue wants to see sugar, but it wants to see it in this very slow, gradual delivery method. And when you do that, your brain wakes up, your mental fatigue goes away, your perception of the exertion that you might be putting out is lessened, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But that's an appropriate way to wake your brain up. That's an appropriate way to get your brain to turn off its perception of fatigue and turn on its perception of energy. So that's one trigger. The palatinose, the type of sugar that we use in the product. Another trigger is the way we deliver caffeine. There's not a lot of caffeine in EMV, but there is some. It's not one of those caffeine bombs that you can find out there on the grocery store shelf or the convenience store shelf. There's some caffeine, but it's not so much the level of caffeine, it's the way we deliver it. Natural forms of caffeine, such as yerba mate, such as green tea, such as some of the other natural sources that we have built into the product, just like palatinose, are being delivered a little more slowly than the synthetic caffeines that you see as the predominant source in those other energy drinks. And so again, the difference is you're not getting that jolt, and if you want the jolt, choose something else. If you want a gradual change in perception, fatigue slowly going away, energy slowly coming back up, and lasting and not having you drop off that cliff 60 to 90 minutes later, EMV is a product for you. So that's a second trigger. That's a second set of receptors in the brain that are responding to that slow delivery of natural sources of caffeine. So now we're switching off two of the brain's primary fatigue receptors. There's a third one, and that third one just so happens to respond to something else that we have in the products. Flavonoids. So I was at a conference in England at the end of December, Sport Nutrition Conference, and one of my colleagues was presenting some of his research on how they can get athletes to reduce their perception of fatigue while they're exercising at a high rate of exertion. And so one of the ways was to deliver natural sources of caffeine. One of the ways was to deliver low glycemic sugars, and that's exactly what palatinose is. In fact, EMV is the only energy drink on the market that can claim, based on scientific measurements, that we are low glycemic. We can show what a standard energy drink is going to give you in terms of a blood sugar spike, and we can contrast that with what EMV does, a much lower spike, a much more gradual delivery, a much more sustained state of fatigue going away and energy increasing. So that third piece that he showed the caffeine piece and showed brain images lighting up in the areas where anti-fatigue perception was happening. He showed the same sort of a brain scan in a different part of the brain for the sugar part. And then the third brain scan that he showed was in yet a third part of the brain that was responding to flavonoids. And you can't find another energy drink on the market that has the kind of flavonoids that we have in the EMV drinks. We're talking about acai, we're talking about jabuticaba, we're talking about a whole range, a whole blend of high flavonoid fruits. So that's another unique way that EMV is working to be that anti-fatigue product. So how do we know this? We know because when people try EMV, they feel better. Their energy comes back, their fatigue goes down, they don't fall off that cliff, they can just keep going. So that's great. But I'm a scientist, right? I want to look at some of the data. So we did a study a few years ago on EMV, and we looked at athletes. We looked at people who were putting themselves under a fatiguing condition. So this was very exhaustive exercise at a pretty high rate of intensity. And what we found there was we found a reduction in a measurement called rating of perceived exertion, RPE. The statistics in performance studies are always very difficult to look at, but what we found was a 7% reduction in RPE. These athletes who were on the EMV group versus on a placebo group had a 7% reduction in their rating of perceived exertion while they were going through this fatiguing exercise. That's absolutely gigantic. For the elite athletes that I work with, if I could promise them that they could take a drink and then go and fatigue themselves in their exercise and their perception of that effort would be 7% lower, every single one of them would want to get on that. We also had measurements in that study of different psychological parameters. We looked at mental function, we looked at reaction time, we looked at psychological parameters such as vigor, which is this mental physical energy state. And they all went in the direction that we hoped they would with EMV. The EMV group was clearly doing better than the placebo group. So that tells us that even when we go to one of these performance studies and collect data, we're seeing that kind of a benefit in people. And it's, again, like I always say in these From the Lab episodes, it's the biology driving the behavior. We know what we can do in the body to help somebody become more flexible. We know what we can do in the body to help somebody control their appetite. We know what we can do in the body to help somebody reduce their stress. And now with EMV, we know what we can do in the body by adjusting these 3 triggers in the brain to help somebody reduce their perception of fatigue. And so that's what I mean when I say it's an anti-fatigue drink and not an energy drink. You know, people will look at that little can and they'll think they know what they're getting, but they have no idea. And that's where we come in, where we can educate people and we can say, look, give this a try. First of all, it tastes great, so there's no problem getting over that. Second of all, when they feel that in their body, they're gonna say, you know what, this is different. This is different than what I'm used to. So this clearly isn't what's on the shelf over there. It's a different way of thinking. And that's what MonaVie is all about. It's all about using the traditional things that we can do with nutrition, looking at flavonoids, for instance, looking at these natural sources of caffeine from plants and roots, looking at using science to say, hey, there's this new type of sugar that MonaVie is the only one to be using in an energy drink, and combining all of that together, the tradition, the nature, the science, and putting it together in a way that we can just say to somebody, here's your solution. Here's what's going to help you feel better. So that's EMV. I hope you get a perspective for how it's different and how you can share that with people. And join me next time on From the Lab, where we're going to delve into a little bit of the science around this measurement called ORAC, O-R-A-C. Oxygen radical absorbance capacity. And in that episode, we're going to go beyond ORAC. We're going to talk about the theory, we're going to talk about how it's measured, we're going to talk about how it applies to products, and we're going to talk about how it applies to your body. So tune in on that. It'll be a great nerd fest where we'll get into all the details. So join me next time on From the Lab. Thanks a lot. This is Dr. Shawn Talbott.